He thought she was just a waitress. But that night, under flickering hotel lights, something shifted that neither of them would ever forget. Naomi Carter's hands trembled slightly as she balanced a tray of half-empty glasses, the distant hum of laughter from the VIP lounge echoing behind her like a reminder of where she didn't belong. Just 10 minutes earlier, they had laughed at her. Sharp, careless laughter that cut deeper than it should have. One man waving his hand dismissively, calling her invisible, as if she were part of the furniture, not a person. She had lowered her eyes, swallowed the sting, and walked away because rent was due in 4 days and dignity didn't pay bills. Outside, the night air hit colder than expected, the kind that crept through fabric and settled into your bones, and Naomi wrapped her thin jacket tighter as she stepped onto the curb behind the hotel, where staff went to breathe between shifts. That's when she saw him. A man, tall even while slumped against the sidewalk, his expensive coat soaked through from the light drizzle, one arm hanging loosely at his side, as if the weight of the world had finally caught up with him. Anyone else might have kept walking. In this city, you learn to mind your business. But Naomi paused. Something about the stillness didn't feel right. She glanced back toward the glowing hotel entrance, where polished marble floors and chandeliers hid moments like this, then back at him. "Hey," she said softly, crouching down, her voice steady despite the uncertainty tightening in her chest. No response. Just the faint rise and fall of his breathing. Up close, she noticed the details. The tailored suit that probably cost more than her monthly paycheck. The faint scent of expensive cologne mixed with rain. The kind of presence that didn't disappear just because the man had fallen. He wasn't just anyone. But still, he was human. Naomi slipped off her jacket without thinking, draping it over his shoulders, her fingers brushing against the cold fabric as she adjusted it to keep him warm. "You can't stay out here," she murmured, more to herself than to him, already shifting her weight to help lift him. He was heavier than she expected, solid, grounded, like someone used to being in control. For a second, she hesitated, her mind flashing back to the laughter, the humiliation, the way the world had just reminded her exactly where she stood. She could walk away. No one would blame her. No one would even know. But instead, she tightened her grip and pulled him up, inch by inch, guiding him toward the side entrance, her shoes scraping softly against the pavement. Halfway there, his hand suddenly closed around her wrist, not hard, but enough to stop her. His eyes opened, dark and sharp despite the haze, locking onto hers with a kind of intensity that made most people look away. "What do you want?" he asked, voice low, controlled, even now. Naomi didn't flinch. She didn't pull away. She just met his gaze, calm and unwavering. "Nothing," she said quietly. "You needed help." And for a moment, something unreadable passed across his face, something quieter than anger, deeper than suspicion. He studied her as if trying to understand a language he'd never learned. The rain continued to fall, soft against the pavement, the city moving on around them without noticing. And in that small, fragile silence, the balance between power and humanity shifted, just slightly, but enough to change everything. Naomi felt the weight of his hand linger on her wrist even after he released it, not as a threat, but as a question that had not yet been answered. And for a brief second, she wondered if she had made a mistake stepping into a moment that did not belong to her. But she steadied herself, adjusted her grip under his arm, and continued guiding him forward. Each slow step echoing softly against the concrete as the glow from the hotel's side entrance grew closer, warmer, almost unreal compared to the cold rain behind them. And when they finally reached the door, one of the night guards straightened immediately, his expression shifting from boredom to sharp alertness the moment he recognized the man leaning against her, his posture snapping upright as if pulled by an invisible thread. "Sir," he said quickly, moving forward. But then his eyes flicked to Naomi, scanning her uniform, her damp hair, the worn shoes that marked her as staff, and something in his tone changed, hesitant, uncertain. What happened here? Naomi did not answer right away, not because she did not know what to say, but because she was suddenly aware of how small she looked standing beside someone who clearly mattered more in this world, someone whose presence alone made people adjust their voices, their posture, their entire sense of self. And yet she did not step back. She did not let go. "He was outside," she said simply, her voice calm, steady. "He needed help." The guard nodded quickly, already signaling for assistance, but his attention never fully left the man. And in that moment, Naomi realized something she had not understood before. This was not just a guest. This was someone who carried weight in ways that could not be seen on the surface. Someone whose absence would be noticed immediately, whose presence changed the air in the room. And as two more staff members rushed forward to take over, she felt his hand tighten slightly again, not enough to stop her, just enough to hold her there for one more second, his eyes meeting hers once more, clearer now, sharper, searching, as if trying to fix her face in his memory before the world stepped back in. And then just as quickly, he was gone, lifted from her grasp and surrounded by people who spoke in careful, measured tones, guiding him through doors that she was never meant to enter, the warmth of the lobby spilling out briefly before swallowing him whole, leaving Naomi standing alone in the dim light of the service entrance, her jacket still draped over his shoulders, her hands empty now, the silence settling in around her as if nothing had happened at all. She looked down at her uniform, damp at the edges, her fingers still tingling from where he had held her, and for a moment she allowed herself to feel it, the strange weight of being seen, even if only for a second, before she shook her head slightly, grounding herself. Because people like him did not remember people like her. That was how the world worked. She had learned that lesson long ago. And yet as she stepped back into the hallway, the bright lights almost blinding after the darkness outside, she could not ignore the quiet shift inside her chest, something subtle but undeniable, like a door that had opened just a crack. And somewhere deeper in the building, beyond polished floors and closed doors, a man who had everything lay awake longer than expected, replaying a single moment in the rain, a voice that asked for nothing, and a pair of eyes that did not look away. And for the first time in a long time, he did not dismiss it. He did not forget. He remembered. The next morning arrived like it always did, bright lights, polished floors, and the quiet expectation that everything would continue exactly as before. And for Naomi, it almost did, because by the time her shift began, the memory of the rain, the weight of that moment, had already been tucked away beneath routine. She tied her apron, adjusted her name tag, and stepped back into the dining floor where conversations flowed easily and laughter filled the air as if the night before had never existed. And yet something was different, subtle but impossible to ignore. The way the staff moved with a little more urgency, the way the manager spoke in hushed tones near the front desk, the way security lingered longer than usual at certain corners, as if the building itself had not yet settled. Naomi noticed it, but said nothing, because noticing was something she had learned to keep to herself. Invisibility was safer that way. And for the first hour, she worked like she always did, taking orders, refilling glasses, offering quiet smiles that were rarely returned, until she stepped into the service corridor and overheard a conversation that made her slow down just enough to listen. "He is asking about her," one of the supervisors whispered, her voice low but urgent. "He wants to know who she is." Naomi paused, not because she thought it could be about her, but because curiosity had a way of slipping through even the strongest walls. "Which one?" another voice asked, and there was a brief silence before the answer came. "The waitress from last night." Naomi felt something tighten in her chest, a small, unexpected shift that she quickly pushed aside. It could not be her. There were dozens of waitresses, dozens of people who passed through unnoticed every day. And she had learned long ago not to attach meaning to things that were not meant for her. So she kept moving, stepping back onto the floor with the same quiet rhythm. But now there was a new awareness in the air, one that followed her without being seen. And across the lobby, behind glass doors and guarded entrances, a man stood looking out over the same space with a focus that cut through the noise. Alexander Romano no longer looked like the man from the rain. His suit was immaculate, his posture controlled, every detail restored to the image the world expected. But his mind lingered somewhere else, somewhere quieter, somewhere unfamiliar. He held a cup of coffee he had not touched, his gaze distant, replaying a single sentence that refused to leave. "You needed help." Not a demand, not a question, just a statement, simple and unguarded. And that was what unsettled him most, because in a world where everything had a price, she had asked for nothing, and that kind of silence carried more weight than any deal he had ever made. He turned slightly as one of his men approached, waiting for instruction, but instead of speaking immediately, Alexander looked once more at the crowd below, at the movement of staff who blended into the background, and somewhere among them was the one person who had not treated him like power. And that was something he could not ignore, not anymore. "Find her," he said finally, his voice calm but absolute. And down below, Naomi continued her shift, unaware that the world she thought would forget her had just begun to turn in her direction. By midday, the tension in the hotel had sharpened into something visible, something people could feel even if they did not understand it. Conversations paused when certain footsteps echoed too close. Managers checked their watches more often, and Naomi found herself being watched in a way she could not explain, not openly, not directly, but enough to make her movements feel slightly heavier, as if each step carried more weight than before. She kept her head down, focusing on the small things she could control, the steady placement of plates, the careful pouring of water, the quiet, "have a good afternoon," that rarely received a response. And yet the feeling did not leave. It followed her through the corridors, lingered at the edges of her awareness, until finally, it caught up to her in the form of a voice she recognized instantly. "Naomi." Her supervisor called, not sharply, but with a tone that carried something different, something measured. Naomi turned, her expression calm, but her mind already preparing for whatever came next, because in places like this, being called out by name rarely meant anything simple. "Yes, ma'am," she answered, stepping closer, the noise of the dining room fading slightly as if the moment had created its own space. Her supervisor hesitated for a fraction of a second, then lowered her voice. "Someone is asking for you." Naomi blinked once, just enough to register the words without reacting too quickly. "For me?" she repeated quietly, not out of confusion, but out of instinct. Because her name was not one that people usually requested, it was one that passed unnoticed. "Yes," the supervisor replied, her eyes searching Naomi's face as if trying to read something beneath the surface. "And it is not a request you ignore." There was a pause, a silence that stretched just long enough to shift the air, and then she added, "Go to the executive floor." Naomi felt the words settle slowly, like something heavier than they should have been. The executive floor was not a place. She went, not a place meant for her. It existed in a different world within the same building, one that she had only seen from a distance, where doors remained closed and conversations happened behind glass and steel. She nodded once, steady, controlled. "I understand." And without asking another question, she removed her apron, folded it neatly, and placed it aside, her hands moving with quiet precision even as her thoughts began to shift, because this was not normal, and she knew it. The walk to the elevator felt longer than usual, each step echoing softly against the marble as the familiar noise of the hotel faded behind her, replaced by a quieter, more controlled silence, the kind that existed where decisions were made, not served. When the elevator doors closed, she caught her reflection in the mirrored wall, her uniform simple, her posture straight, her eyes calm but alert, and for a moment, she allowed herself to acknowledge the question forming beneath everything else. Why her? The elevator moved smoothly, rising floor by floor, each number lighting up with a soft glow until it reached a level she had never stepped onto before. The doors opened to a hallway that felt different. Immediately, softer lighting, thicker carpet, fewer sounds, as if the entire floor existed on a separate rhythm. Naomi stepped out slowly, her senses sharpening as she took in the space. And at the far end of the hall, a figure stood waiting, still, composed, and unmistakable. Alexander Romano did not move as she approached, his presence alone enough to quiet the air around him. And when she finally stopped a few feet away, he looked at her with the same intensity as before, but now there was something else beneath it, something quieter, more deliberate. "You left," he said, not as an accusation, not as a complaint, just a statement that carried more meaning than it seemed. Naomi held his gaze, steady as ever. "You did not need me anymore," she replied simply, and for a brief moment, the space between them held something unspoken, something that neither power nor position could define. And then, almost imperceptibly, the corner of his expression shifted, not quite a smile, not quite anything familiar, but enough to signal that this conversation was not going to follow the rules either of them were used to. Alexander did not look away, not immediately, and that alone was enough to shift the balance of the room, because men like him were not used to being answered so plainly, not used to hearing words that carried no fear, no calculation, just truth. And for a brief second, something in his posture stilled, as if the world had paused to let the moment settle. Most people would have stayed, he said finally, his voice low but steady. Most people would have asked for something. Naomi's expression did not change, her hands resting calmly at her sides. Most people expect something in return, she replied, her tone even, not challenging, not submissive, just certain, and the quiet that followed was heavier than before, because this was not a conversation built on status or power. It was something else entirely, something neither of them had prepared for. Alexander took a slow step closer, not enough to intimidate, but enough to close the distance, his presence filling the space without effort. "And you do not?" he asked, not as a test, but as a genuine question, one that seemed to carry more weight than it should have. Naomi met his gaze without hesitation. "If I needed something, I would have asked," she said, and there it was again, that stillness, that subtle shift in the air, like something invisible had been placed between them, something that could not be ignored. Alexander exhaled slowly, the tension in his shoulders easing just slightly, and for the first time since she had stepped onto this floor, he looked less like a man surrounded by control and more like someone considering something unfamiliar. "Do you know who I am?" he asked, the question simple, but layered with meaning. Naomi did not look away, but she also did not rush to answer. "I know enough," she said after a moment, and that answer seemed to interest him more than any direct response could have. "Enough to be careful," he added quietly, and she shook her head just slightly. "No," she said, "enough to know that last night, you were just a person who needed help." The words settled between them, steady and unshaken, and something in Alexander's expression shifted again, not sharply, not dramatically, but enough to reveal that this was not a perspective he encountered often. If ever, he studied her for a long moment, as if measuring something that could not be seen, and then, without raising his voice, without changing his tone, he said something that altered the direction of everything. "Come with me." Naomi did not move right away, not out of fear, but out of awareness, because nothing in her life had prepared her for moments like this, and yet she nodded once, trusting the same instinct that had led her into the rain the night before. Alexander turned and walked toward a set of doors at the end of the hallway, doors that opened quietly as he approached, revealing a room that felt different from anything Naomi had seen in the building before, not because of luxury, though it was there in every detail, but because of what it represented. Decisions were made here, not served. Power existed here in its most controlled form. He stepped inside and waited, and after a brief pause, Naomi followed, the door closing softly behind her, sealing the space in. Silence. Alexander moved toward the center of the room, then turned to face her again, his expression now fully composed, every trace of uncertainty tucked away beneath something more deliberate. "There are very few moments in my life that are not planned," he said, his voice measured. "Last night was not one of them." Naomi listened, her posture unchanged, her presence steady. "And I do not ignore things that are not planned," he continued, and now there was something else in his tone, something that hinted at a decision already forming, especially when they changed the way I see something. He held her gaze as he said it, not looking past her, not dismissing her, but seeing her fully, in a way that carried more weight than any title or position ever could. And in that quiet, controlled room, something began to take shape, something neither of them had expected, but neither of them could walk away from. Naomi stood in the center of the room without shifting her weight, without letting the polished silence intimidate her, even though everything around her spoke a language she had never been taught. The floor beneath her feet softer, the air cooler, the kind of space where every object had a purpose and every decision carried consequences. And yet she did not shrink, she did not lower her gaze, because whatever this moment was, it had already stepped beyond the boundaries she understood, and stepping back now would not change that. Alexander watched her closely, not with suspicion, not with dominance, but with something far more precise, as if he were trying to understand a pattern that did not follow the rules he had spent his life mastering. He moved slowly toward a large desk at the far side of the room. His steps measured, controlled, then rested his hand lightly against its edge, not sitting, not claiming distance, just grounding himself in a space that had always belonged to him. "Do you like working here?" he asked, the question unexpected, simple on the surface but layered beneath. Naomi did not answer immediately, not because she did not know, but because she understood that this was not about the job itself. She glanced briefly toward the window, where the city stretched out in quiet lines of movement, then back at him. "It is work," she said, her tone calm. "It pays what I need it to pay." Alexander's expression did not change, but something in his eyes sharpened slightly. "That is not what I asked," he replied, and the space between them held that same quiet tension again, not uncomfortable, just honest. Naomi exhaled softly, her shoulders remaining steady. "No," she said, this time without hesitation, "I do not like it." And there it was, the kind of answer most people would soften, reshape, or hide completely. But she did not, and Alexander seemed to take that in with a kind of quiet acknowledgement, as if truth, in its simplest form, carried more weight than anything else. He nodded once, slowly, then stepped closer again, reducing the distance between them just enough to make the moment more direct. "Then why stay?" he asked. And this time there was no hesitation at all. "Because I do not have the luxury of leaving," Naomi answered, her voice steady but not defensive, just real. And something about that answer shifted the air again, because it was not a complaint, it was not bitterness, it was acceptance, the kind that came from understanding exactly where you stood in the world and continuing anyway. Alexander turned slightly, his gaze drifting toward the city beyond the glass, his reflection faintly visible in the window. And for a moment, he was silent, longer than before, as if measuring not her words, but what they meant against everything he believed about control, choice, and power. "Luxury," he repeated quietly, almost to himself, then looked back at her, and there was something different now, something more deliberate, more resolved. "What if that changed?" he asked, the question landing softly but carrying a weight that could not be ignored. Naomi did not react the way most people would. She did not step forward, did not ask for clarification, did not let curiosity override her sense of reality. She simply looked at him, steady, grounded. "Things like that do not change for people like me," she said. Not dismissive, not hopeful, just certain. And for a brief second, something almost like frustration flickered beneath Alexander's composure, not directed at her, but at the idea itself, the limitation, the boundary she accepted as fact. He took a slow breath, then straightened slightly, the decision forming fully now. "They do when I decide they do," he said, his voice calm, controlled, and absolute. And the room seemed to settle around those words, as if recognizing the shift before it fully arrived. Naomi held his gaze, not intimidated, not impressed, but aware that something had changed, not in the room, not in the building, but in the direction of her life, even if she did not yet understand how. And in that quiet moment, where power met something it could not control, the next step had already begun, even if neither of them spoke it out loud. Naomi did not respond right away, not because she was unsure, but because she understood something that most people in that position would not. Promises made in rooms like this did not come from impulse. They came from decisions already forming beneath the surface. And yet she had lived long enough to know that decisions made by powerful men did not always consider the lives they reshaped. She shifted her weight slightly, grounding herself in the moment. "And what exactly are you deciding?" she asked, her voice calm, not confrontational, but steady enough to hold its place in the room. Alexander watched her carefully, as if measuring not just her words, but the way she carried them, the absence of fear, the refusal to bend into expectation. And for a moment, he did not answer. Instead, he reached for a folder resting on the edge of the desk, something that had likely been placed there long before she arrived. He opened it slowly, not for effect, but with the kind of control that came naturally to him, then slid it across the surface toward her. "Take a look," he said, his tone even. Naomi hesitated for the briefest second before stepping forward, her fingers brushing the edge of the folder as she opened it, her eyes scanning the first page. then the second, and then stopping completely. Not because she did not understand what she was reading, but because she understood it too well. Numbers, contracts, ownership structures, details that belonged to a world far removed from hers. And yet her name was there, clear, unmistakable, placed where it should not have been. Her expression did not change dramatically, but something behind her eyes shifted, something deeper than surprise, something closer to disbelief held in check by years of learning not to react too quickly. She looked up at him slowly. "This is not possible," she said, not as a rejection, but as a statement of reality as she knew it. Alexander did not move, did not rush to explain. He simply met her gaze. "It is," he replied, calm, certain, and the weight of that certainty settled into the room. Naomi closed the folder carefully, her hands steady despite the shift happening inside her. "Why?" she asked, the question simple, but carrying everything beneath it, because nothing like this happened without reason, without intention, and she needed to understand what stood behind it. Alexander took a slow breath, his posture unchanged, but his voice quieter now, more deliberate. "Because last night, you did something no one else did," he said, and there was no exaggeration in his tone, no attempt to make the moment larger than it was, just truth. "You saw me as a person," he continued, "not as a name, not as power, not as something to gain from." Naomi held his gaze, listening, but not softening, not accepting without question. "And that is worth more than anything in that folder," he finished, and the silence that followed was different now, heavier, because this was no longer just a conversation. It was a turning point. Naomi shook her head slightly, not dismissing him, but grounding herself again. "You are trying to repay something that was not a transaction," she said, her voice steady. And for the first time, Alexander's expression shifted in a way that revealed something closer to understanding. "No," he replied. "I am acknowledging something that changed the way I see the world I built." And those words carried a different weight entirely, because they were not about her alone, they were about him, about what had shifted inside him in a moment he had not planned. Naomi looked down at the folder. Again, then back at him, her eyes steady, thoughtful, and for the first time, there was a pause that did not come from hesitation, but from the realization that whatever happened next would not just change her life, it would redefine it completely. And in that quiet, controlled room, where everything had always followed a certain order, something new had entered, something that could not be undone, and neither of them stepped away. Naomi let the silence stretch, not out of defiance, but because she understood that accepting something too quickly often meant losing control of it just as fast, her fingers resting lightly on the closed folder as if it might disappear if she held it too tightly. And for the first time since she had entered the room, her gaze shifted away from Alexander, not in submission, but in thought, her eyes moving toward the window again, toward the city that had shaped every choice she had ever made, every compromise, every quiet acceptance of what was and what was not meant for her. And when she finally spoke, her voice carried something deeper than before, something grounded in experience. "You cannot just change someone's life like this," she said, not accusing, not rejecting, just stating a truth she had lived by. Alexander did not interrupt, did not correct her. He simply listened, which in itself was a departure from everything he represented. Naomi continued, her tone steady but more personal now. "You can sign papers, you can move money, you can make decisions in rooms like this." She gestured slightly around them, not dismissively, but with awareness. "But you do not live what comes after." The words settled into the space with a quiet weight, because they were not spoken out of fear, but out of understanding. And for a moment, Alexander said nothing, his expression unreadable, his posture still, as if he were considering not just her words, but the reality behind them. "You think this is about control," he said finally, his voice calm, but lower than before, more measured. Naomi met his gaze again, unshaken. "Is it not?" she asked, and there was no challenge in her tone, just clarity, and that question lingered, longer than expected. Because for the first time, it did not have an immediate answer. Alexander exhaled slowly, the kind of breath that came when something familiar no longer fit as easily as it once did. "It used to be," he admitted, and that admission, quiet as it was, shifted something fundamental in the room, Because men like him did not often acknowledge change, especially not in themselves. He stepped closer again, not imposing, not dominating, but present, fully present. But this is different, he added. And there was no hesitation in his voice now, just certainty of a different kind. Naomi studied him carefully, not looking for weakness, but for truth. Because if this moment was real, if this decision carried meaning beyond impulse, then it needed to stand on something stronger than power alone. Then explain it to me, she said. And this time, there was a quiet demand beneath her words, not for authority, but for honesty. Alexander nodded once, slowly, as if accepting that request carried more weight than any contract ever could. You walked away, he said, his eyes steady on hers. Not because you had to, but because you believed that what you did not entitle you to anything more. Naomi did not respond, but she did not look away either. That is not how the world I built works, he continued. In my world, everything has a price. Everything has an exchange. He paused, just long enough for the contrast to settle. And you broke that. The words were simple, but they carried something deeper, something closer to recognition than explanation. Naomi felt that shift again, subtle but undeniable, like a line that had once been clear was now blurred. So this is about you, she said quietly, not dismissing him, but understanding the core of it. And for the first time, Alexander did not correct her. He did not redirect the meaning. He simply held her gaze and answered with the same honesty she had demanded. Yes, he said. It is. And in that moment, the truth stood between them, unguarded and complete. This was not charity. It was not repayment. It was something far more complex. Something that neither power nor position could fully define. And Naomi understood that. She understood that whatever decision was forming here was not just about her future. It was about the shift happening inside a man who had never needed to question his own world before. And that realization carried a weight of its own, one that could not be ignored, one that demanded a choice, not from him, but from her. And for the first time since she had stepped into this room, Naomi felt the full gravity of what stood in front of her, not just an opportunity, but a turning point that would require her to step into something she had never imagined. And she did not answer right away, because some decisions deserved silence before they were spoken. Naomi's silence was not hesitation. It was calculation, the kind that came from years of understanding that every decision carried consequences that did not always reveal themselves immediately. She looked down at the folder again, then back at Alexander, her eyes steady but deeper now, as if she were no longer just listening, but measuring the weight of everything he had said against the life she had lived. If I accept this, she began slowly, her voice calm but deliberate, then I do not get to go back. And that was not a question, it was a fact, because she understood something most people in that position would overlook. Stepping forward meant leaving something behind, even if that something was not worth holding on to. Alexander nodded once, not interrupting, not softening the reality, because he knew she was right. No, he said simply, and the honesty in that answer made the moment heavier, not easier. Naomi exhaled quietly, her shoulders remaining straight, her posture grounded. Then this is not a gift, she continued, her gaze unwavering. It is a responsibility. And that word settled into the room with a different kind of weight, one that shifted the meaning of everything that had come before, because now this was not about reward. It was about what came next. Alexander's expression changed almost imperceptibly, not surprised, but acknowledging, as if she had just named something he had not put into words himself. Yes, he said, and there was no hesitation this time. It is. The air between them tightened slightly, not with tension, but with clarity. Naomi took a small step forward, closing the distance just enough to make her presence undeniable, not as someone being given something, but as someone deciding whether to take it. And if I do this, she added, her voice still calm, still controlled, I do it my way. And that was the moment where most people would have expected resistance, expected a reminder of who stood in control of the room. But Alexander did not interrupt. He did not assert authority. He simply watched her, as if this was the part he had been waiting for. Your way, he repeated, not as a challenge, but as confirmation. Naomi nodded once. No shortcuts, no hidden expectations, No one's speaking for me, she said, each word clear, each condition grounded in the same dignity she had carried into the rain, and for a moment, the room held its breath. Because this was not how these conversations usually unfolded. This was not negotiation built on leverage. This was something else entirely, something that did not follow the structure of power. And then, slowly, Alexander inclined his head, a small movement, but one that carried more meaning than any command ever could. Agreed, he said, and that single word shifted everything, not because of what it gave her, but because of what it acknowledged. Naomi did not smile. She did not react outwardly, but something inside her settled, something that had been uncertain now finding its place. She reached for the folder again, this time with intention, opening it once more, her eyes moving across the pages not as someone overwhelmed, but as someone stepping into understanding. The details were still complex, still far beyond anything she had been part of before, but now they did not feel impossible. They felt real, and that made all the difference. She closed the folder again, more firmly this time, and looked up at him. "Then I accept," she said, and the words did not echo. They did not need to, because their impact was already there. The shift had happened, not in the building, not in the city, but in the space between two people who had just rewritten the terms of something neither of them had planned. And as the silence settled once more, it was no longer uncertain, it was final, because the moment had passed from possibility into reality, and there was no going back. The moment the words left Naomi's mouth, something invisible but undeniable settled into place, not like a celebration, not like a victory, but like a door closing behind her with a quiet finality. And Alexander did not rush to respond. He simply studied her for a second longer, as if confirming that what he had just witnessed was real, not hesitation, not impulse, but decision. And then he gave a slight nod, the kind that did not need to be repeated. "Then we begin now," he said, his voice steady. And with that, the air in the room shifted again, not with tension, but with movement, purpose replacing uncertainty. He reached for the phone on the desk and pressed a single button, his actions precise, controlled. "Have them come up," he said calmly. And within seconds, there was a quiet knock at the door, not loud, not hesitant, just expected, the kind of knock that followed instructions without question. Naomi did not move, but her awareness sharpened, because this was the moment where everything she had just accepted would begin to take shape. The door opened smoothly, and three individuals stepped inside, dressed in tailored suits, their presence composed, professional, their eyes immediately shifting from Alexander to Naomi. And for a brief second, there was a flicker of something unspoken, not confusion exactly, but recalibration, as if they were adjusting to a reality they had not been informed of until now. Alexander did not explain. He did not introduce her with formality. He simply stepped slightly to the side, creating space where there had been none before. "This is Naomi Carter," he said, his tone even, but carrying the kind of authority that required no elaboration. "Effective immediately. She will be overseeing this property." The words landed cleanly, without pause, without room for interpretation, and the silence that followed was immediate and complete, not because they did not understand, but because they did, and that understanding required a moment to settle. Naomi felt it, the shift in the room, the way their posture adjusted, the way their attention realigned, not dramatically, but enough to signal that something fundamental had changed. One of them stepped forward slightly, his expression controlled, but his eyes searching. "Understood," he said after a brief pause, his voice respectful, measured, and that single word carried more weight than any reaction could have, because it meant acceptance, not of her personally, but of the decision that stood behind her. Alexander glanced at Naomi briefly, not to check her, but to acknowledge the moment, and then he stepped back fully, removing himself from the center of the room in a way that was almost imperceptible, but deeply intentional, because for the first time since she had entered, the space did not belong to him. It belonged to her. Naomi felt the weight of that immediately, not as pressure, but as presence. Something solid, something real. She took a slow breath, grounding herself in the moment, and then she stepped forward, not quickly, not hesitantly, just with purpose, her voice calm as she spoke. I want a full report of current operations by the end of the day, she said. And there was no tremor, no uncertainty, just clarity. The kind that came from understanding that hesitation would define her more than any title ever could. The three individuals nodded almost in unison, already adjusting, already moving, because the structure had shifted and they were responding to it. The room remained quiet, but it was no longer uncertain. It was active, alive with the beginning of something new. And as Naomi stood there, no longer at the edge, no longer unseen, the distance between who she had been that morning and who she was now became something she could no longer ignore, not because it overwhelmed her, but because she had chosen it. And across the room, Alexander watched in silence, not intervening, not directing, just observing. And for the first time, there was no calculation in his gaze, no strategy, just recognition, because what he had set in motion was no longer his to control. And that was exactly what made it real. The room did not erupt into movement. It did not shift dramatically, but something far more powerful happened instead. Everything aligned, the subtle hum of decisions being carried out without question, without delay, and Naomi stood at the center of it, not as someone reacting, but as someone directing. Even if she had only just stepped into that role, the three individuals moved with quiet efficiency, gathering their materials, already preparing to fulfill her request, and as they exited, the door closed softly behind them, leaving the space momentarily still again. But this time the silence felt different, not uncertain, not heavy, but settled, like the calm after something irreversible had taken place. Naomi exhaled slowly, not out of relief, but to ground herself, because everything had changed in a matter of minutes. And yet she could not afford to let that change show on the surface. She turned slightly, her gaze moving across the room, taking in details she had not noticed before. The placement of documents, the structure of the space, the way everything had been arranged with intention, and now, that intention extended to her. She walked toward the desk, not hesitantly, but with measured steps, her hand brushing lightly against the surface as she positioned herself behind it, not claiming it, but acknowledging it. And for a brief moment, she allowed herself to feel it, the weight of standing in a place she had never imagined, not as an outsider, not as staff, but as someone who now belonged in that space. And across from her, Alexander remained where he was, his posture unchanged, his presence quieter now, as if he had stepped out of the frame of control he once occupied, watching without interruption, without guidance. And that absence of interference was not passive, it was intentional. Naomi looked up at him, her expression steady, but now there was something else there, something more grounded. "This does not change what happened last night," she said, her voice calm, not questioning, just clear, and the words carried a subtle weight, because they drew a line between the moment that had started everything and the reality now unfolding. Alexander met her gaze, his expression composed. "No," he replied simply, and that answer held more meaning than anything else he could have said, because it confirmed that this was not about rewriting the past. It was about building something from it. Naomi nodded once, accepting that, and then her attention shifted back to the room, to the responsibility that now stood in front of her, the folder still resting on the desk, the decisions already in motion, and for the first time, she allowed herself to step fully into it, not as someone filling a role, but as someone defining it. She reached for a pen, not out of habit, but out of purpose, and began reviewing the first set of documents left behind, her focus sharp, her movements precise, because hesitation was no longer an option. Minutes passed, quiet, controlled, the kind of silence that carried progress rather than uncertainty. And then there was another knock at the door, softer this time, more cautious. Naomi did not look up immediately, finishing the line she was reading before. "Speaking, come in," she said, her tone even, and when the door opened, the expression on the face that appeared was different from the others, less composed, more uncertain. Someone from the staff below, someone who had seen her earlier that day in a completely different role. And the moment their eyes met, the shift was unmistakable, recognition mixed with disbelief, and then quickly replaced by something else, something closer to respect, the kind that did not come easily. "We have prepared the initial reports," they said, their voice careful, controlled, and Naomi nodded once, gesturing for them to place the documents on the desk, her movements calm, her presence steady, as if this had always been where she belonged. And as the door closed once more, the reality of the transformation settled deeper into the building itself, not announced, not explained, but understood, because change like this did not need to be declared. It revealed itself in the way people looked, the way they spoke, the way they adjusted. And for Naomi, standing behind that desk, no longer invisible, no longer overlooked, the world had not simply shifted around her. She had stepped into a place where she would define how it moved next, and that was something no one in that building had expected, least of all her. By late afternoon, the rhythm of the building had changed in ways that could not be ignored, not loudly, not dramatically, but in the quiet adjustments that only those who paid attention would notice. Conversations that once carried casual authority now paused before reaching conclusions. Decisions that were once made automatically were now reviewed, reconsidered, and Naomi felt it in every interaction, not as resistance, but as recalibration, as if the entire structure was learning how to respond to a presence it had not been built to expect. She remained behind the desk, reviewing reports with steady focus, her movements precise, her attention sharp, because she understood something that many in her position might overlook. Respect was not given once, it was earned repeatedly, and every moment mattered. A soft knock interrupted her concentration, and without looking up immediately, she finished the line she was reading before speaking. "Come in," her voice calm, controlled. The door opened, and this time it was not hesitation that entered the room. It was familiarity. Two senior staff members stepped inside, their posture professional, but their eyes carrying something new, something measured, as if they were no longer assessing whether she belonged, but how she would lead. Naomi gestured slightly toward the chairs in front of the desk, not as an invitation, but as a direction, and they sat without question, placing a series of documents neatly in front of her. "These are the current operational summaries," one of them said, his tone respectful, and Naomi nodded, her gaze moving across the pages quickly, efficiently, absorbing information with the same quiet intensity she had carried through every part of her life. She asked questions, not many, but the kind that revealed more than they seemed, clarifying details, identifying gaps, not to challenge, but to understand. And with each response, the dynamic shifted further, the hesitation fading, replaced by something closer to alignment, because clarity had a way of building trust where uncertainty once stood. After several minutes, she closed the final report, placing it carefully on the desk. "There are inefficiencies in scheduling and resource allocation," she said, her tone even, not critical, just direct. "We will address those first." The two staff members exchanged a brief glance, not in disagreement, but in recognition, because she had identified what many had overlooked, not through authority, but through attention. "Understood." They replied almost in unison, and that word carried weight. Again, not as obligation, but as acceptance. Naomi leaned back slightly, not in relaxation, but in perspective, her eyes moving from the documents to the people in front of her. "And one more thing," she added, her voice steady. "No one on this staff is invisible." The words were simple, but they landed differently, because they came from someone who had lived that reality. And for a moment, the room held that statement in silence, not questioning it, not resisting it, but absorbing it, because it was not a policy. It was a principle, one that would shape everything moving forward. The two staff members nodded again, slower this time, more deliberate, and as they stood to leave, there was a subtle shift in their posture, something closer to respect than before. The door closed behind them, and the room settled once more, but it was no longer the same room it had been hours ago. It carried something new now, something that could not be undone. Naomi remained where she was, her hands resting lightly on the desk, her gaze thoughtful but steady, and across the room, Alexander still stood, watching quietly, not intervening, not guiding, just observing the transformation he had set into motion. And for the first time, there was no distance in his gaze, no calculation, just recognition, because what he was witnessing was not just change, it was something deeper, something that reshaped the very foundation of the world he had built. And as the light outside the window began to shift toward evening, casting long reflections across the glass, The reality of what had begun that night in the rain reached its full form, not as an act of kindness alone, but as the beginning of something that would redefine everything that followed. Evenings settled over the city with a quiet authority, the kind that softened the sharp edges of glass towers and turned reflections into something warmer, something more human. And inside the office, the light shifted gently across the desk, where Naomi still stood, no longer reviewing documents, no longer issuing instructions, but simply present in the space that had changed her life in a matter of hours. She moved slowly toward the window, her steps measured, not out of uncertainty, but out of awareness, because for the first time, she allowed herself to fully take in what had happened. The city stretched out below her, endless, familiar, yet different now, not because it had changed, but because she had. Her reflection in the glass caught her attention. The same face, the same posture, but something deeper had shifted, something that could not be seen from the outside. And behind her, Alexander remained where he had been for most of the afternoon, silent, watching, not as a man, observing an outcome, but as someone witnessing a transformation that he had not fully anticipated. "You are thinking about leaving," he said quietly, not as a question, but as an observation. Naomi did not turn immediately, her gaze still on the city, her voice calm when she answered, "I am thinking about what it means to stay." And that answer carried more weight than anything else she could have said, because it acknowledged the reality of what had been offered, not as an escape, but as a path. She turned then, facing him fully, her expression steady, grounded in the same clarity she had carried from the beginning. "This place will change," she said, not with arrogance, not with promise, but with certainty, not because I own it, but because of how it is run. Alexander met her gaze, and for the first time, there was no distance left between them, no hierarchy defining the space, just two people standing in the aftermath of a moment that had rewritten both of their worlds. He nodded once, slowly, not as approval, but as acknowledgement. "It already has," he replied, and the simplicity of that truth settled into the room. Naomi took a breath, not deep, not dramatic, just enough to center herself, and then she stepped away from the window, moving back toward the desk, not as someone returning to work, but as someone stepping into purpose. She placed her hand lightly on the surface, her posture straight, her presence calm but undeniable, and in that moment, there was no trace of the woman who had stood in the rain the night before, not because she was gone, but because she had become something more, something that carried both who she had been and who she was now. And the silence that followed was not empty. It was full of understanding, full of recognition, full of something that neither power nor status could create on its own. Alexander turned slightly, his gaze shifting toward the city for a brief moment before returning to her, and there was a quiet acceptance in his expression, not of loss, but of change, because what he had set in motion was no longer his to shape, and that was exactly what made it matter. Naomi did